Hey there friends, welcome back to the half-asleep historian. If you enjoy dozing off to unlikely tales and very gentle chaos, go ahead and like this video, and maybe subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Tonight, we're traveling to a forgotten medieval monastery where the scribes weren't just monks, they were squirrels. Yes, tiny, scroll-carrying squirrels in handmade saddlebags. Our story begins, very quietly, by the fire in the scriptorium. You wake up in a stone cell that smells faintly of beeswax and old vellum. The window is no more than a slit in the wall, but the faint light of dawn already spills across the worn flagstone floor in a pale, golden stripe. Somewhere outside, a bell tolls once, gently, the sound drifting across frosted fields like a ripple across a still pond. You are a monk, a quiet one, and although you're not supposed to have favorites, today is your favorite kind of day, cold enough to keep the abbey silent, but warm enough that the squirrels will still be out. You dress in the usual woolen layers, brown and rough, and smelling of lye soap. Your fingers work slowly. Everything here is slow. The rule of Saint Benedict encourages it. One movement at a time, one breath after another. Silence is not just expected, is cultivated like a garden after breakfast, which is a thin broth and a slice of bread with nothing on it but time. You make your way to the scriptorium. It is the heart of the monastery's intellectual life, this narrow hall with its long wooden desks and high-set windows. Sunlight filters in from above, and the dust in the air dances like motes of memory. Here, monks copy books, slowly, lovingly, for hours, for days, for decades. In some cases, you do not write. Your job is stranger. You are the keeper of the squirrels. There are 4 of them. They live in a little hutch just outside the back window of the scriptorium. Brother Anselm, who never really explained where he got the idea, began raising them as kits when you were still a novice. Now they are full grown, red-brown fur, bright black eyes, little paws that grasp, twitch, hesitate. They are not pets. Not exactly. They are co-workers, because if all goes well, and it often doesn't, the squirrels are supposed to help. Help with what? Well, sorting scrolls. It sounds mad even when you think it slowly, like a prayer. But there's a kind of humble logic to it. In a monastery like this one, tucked away in a damp green valley where paper is precious, and time even more so, you see, the library is not vast. It is not even particularly well organized. You do not have shelves and shelves of bound volumes like the great abbeys of York or Tours. You have scrolls, rolls of parchment, labeled in ink that fades, tied with twine that frays, stacked in baskets and pigeonholes, and in the pockets of long, dusty robes that hang unused on hooks. Brother Matthew once spent 4 entire days looking for a treatise. On wind direction, he found it eventually, under a psalter, in the privy dot. So Brother Anselm, part herbalist, part calligrapher, part cheerful heretics, jested a solution. Trained the squirrels, he said one morning, while spreading out herbs to dry near the apothecary oven. They're clever, they're quick, they already love hiding things. Why not teach them to fetch? No one responded. That's how ideas start here, in silence and skepticism. And yet, somehow, 3 months later, there were tiny color-coded pouches sewn onto the backs of young red squirrels. Brother Anselm insisted it was all part of a grand experiment in what he called distributed monastic labor. At first, Your job was simply to feed them. Walnut slivers, toasted oats, dried berries. They were skittish, bounding from shelf to windowsill in twitching loops. But slowly, patiently, you added something to the mix. Scent. You began to rub each scroll with a tiny sachet of herbs, thyme for theology, rosemary for astronomy, mint for music. Then, placing the scented scrolls in their appropriate cubbies, you would wait and watch. Sometimes the squirrels got it right. Sometimes they just ate the mint. Still, there was something marvelously comforting about it all. The quiet scamper of clawed feet on the wooden beams, the whisper of parchment unrolling, the way the squirrels would pause, tiny noses quivering, as if deep in contemplation. Brother Anselm began keeping a chart. It was less scientific than optimistic, but it did show a trend. Over the course of 4 weeks, the squirrels went from completely random misfiling to, well, slightly less random misfiling. Once, astonishingly, one of them brought the correct scroll to the correct monk at the correct time. The abbey nearly exploded in silent applause. Brother Thomas wept into his inkpot. Of course, there were setbacks. One squirrel tried to nest in the basket of psalms and refused to come out for 3 days. Another gnawed through a roll of illuminated marginalia, reducing St. Jerome to a swirl of gold and rodent teeth. But such are the trials of innovation, don't now. As you settle into your stool and open the small window that leads to the squirrel hutch, you feel the crisp air stir your robes. A tiny, furred face pokes out from behind a hay bundle. Then another. You whistle, softly, rising, falling note like the tone of the bell at Lord's. They respond, as they always do. Bounding in, tails like commas in mid-air, landing with the grace of a well-written sentence. You hold out your hand. One of them, his name, unofficially, is Benedict. Sniffs your fingers and twitches. You point to a bundle of scrolls tied with a red ribbon. The squirrel takes off. Is this madness? Perhaps, but in a world of quiet repetition, it is also joy, gentle joy, the kind that scampers through silence and sorts theology by smell. And as the little creature vanishes into the stacks, you allow yourself the smallest of smiles. Not because it will work, but because it almost might. Asterisk, the quiet of the scriptorium is different from the quiet of the chapel. In the chapel, silence is sacred wide, solemn, echoing off stone walls and pooling around candlelight like mist. But in the scriptorium, silence is more practical. It's the kind of hush you get when 30 grown men are concentrating very hard on the difference between Latin and very bad Latin. The air smells of ink, beeswax, and a faint trace of damp wool. The scratching of quills across parchment is steady, rhythmic, almost soothing like a distant stream. No one speaks, no one hums. Even coughs are suppressed, swallowed in the folds of thick sleeves. You sit off to one side, a sort of unofficial squirrel steward, next to a low bench where scrolls are sorted before being passed to the scribes. On good days, the scrolls are delivered by hand. On ambitious days, well, that's where the squirrels come in. Of course, you still remember the early days, the trial period, as Brother Anselm called it, a period marked by equal parts excitement, skepticism, and gnawed parchment. The squirrels, quick, bright, and unfortunately very fond of chewing, struggled at first to grasp the full solemnity of scroll work. One of them, an unusually mischievous female named Tilda, once dragged a vellum scroll containing a rare homily on the nature of divine geometry directly into the fireplace. Thankfully, the fire was not lit, but the scroll now bears a soot smudge. That will never quite come out, like a blemish on a saint's robe. Then there was the incident with the psalter. A particularly delicate copy, lined with blue pigment and gold leaf, had been placed briefly and with what seemed like reasonable safety in a low bench. Moments later, it was mistaken for bedding material. The resulting nest was magnificent, warm, soft, artistic even. But it also destroyed 23 verses and 3 exquisitely painted doves. After that, Brother Anselm introduced what he called scroll discipline. The squirrels were no longer allowed near the parchment stacks, unsupervised. They had to work with training scrolls, simple copies, and illustrated, perfumed lightly with their associated herbs and tied with color-coded ribbons. Thyme for theology, rosemary for astronomy, sage for scripture. It was, at best, a hopeful taxonomy, but the squirrels began to respond. A scroll with rosemary, delivered, albeit slowly, to Brother Luke, the astronomy scribe, a mint-scented roll of music theory, brought sometimes chewed slightly on one end to the choirmaster's bench. Accuracy hovered around 50%, but enthusiasm was at an all-time high. Even the most skeptical monks began to admit that, while not strictly practical, the squirrel system was at least diverting. And in the monastery, where excitement usually meant a shipment of beeswax or a new mold in the cheese cellar, diversion was precious. Still, the challenges were real. For one, squirrels are not always inclined to teamwork, while Benedict and Tilda performed reasonably well under supervision. The younger two, whom Brother Anselm affectionately nicknamed the twins, though no one could tell them apart, had a strong tendency to squabble mid-task, resulting in the occasional scroll tugv war. One particularly regrettable argument ended with a scroll landing in the soup pot. For another, parchment itself seemed to hold an irresistible fascination. The texture, the taste, the faint lingering odor of calfskin. It was almost unfair to ask a squirrel to carry something it instinctively wanted to chew. Brother Anselm began treating the edges of scrolls with a bitter herbal wash, harmless to humans, but unpleasant to rodents. This improved delivery times, but led to several squirrels adopting dramatic expressions of betrayal and once what could only be described as a sulk dot. And then there were the monks themselves. Not everyone approved of the endeavor. Brother Ulrich, the abbey's oldest scribe and self-proclaimed guardian of the Latin language, referred to the squirrels as the rodent heresy. He refused to touch any scroll delivered by paw, insisting that true knowledge could not be transmitted by twitching vermin. One day, after discovering a squirrel perched serenely on his writing desk, he fled the scriptorium and did not return for 3 days. Even those more open to novelty occasionally raised concerns. Brother Thomas, who copied medicinal texts and had an unfortunate tendency toward drama, once claimed the squirrels were conspiring to swap recipes for laxatives with treatises on penance. This was never proven. Yet despite setbacks, the experiment pressed on. You remember the day the abbey's abbot finally agreed to witness the squirrels at work. A trial run was arranged. The scrolls were perfumed, the ribbons tied, the squirrels lightly combed and encouraged with walnut bits. The monks gathered in a semicircle of quiet anticipation. It did not go well. The squirrels, perhaps overwhelmed by the attention, promptly leaped onto the abbot's robe, scurried down his sleeve, and deposited 3 theology scrolls, none of which he had requested, at his feet. The abbot, to his credit, did not shout. He did not even frown. He merely blinked, picked up one scroll, and read aloud. On the relative virtues of celestial choirs in the 5th age of man. Then he said, "Well, At least it's alphabetized. After that, the squirrels were permitted to continue, with some modest restrictions and the firm understanding that no scrolls were to be delivered during Mass. Now, many months later, the system persists. It is not perfect, it is not efficient, but it has a rhythm. You pass the mornings gently coaxing the squirrels through their tasks. One by one, they bound down the narrow wooden gangways constructed between shelves. They sniff, they hesitate. They deliver sometimes to the wrong monk, sometimes slightly damp, but almost always with conviction, and in the stillness of the scriptorium, with the dust dancing in beams of winter light. It's hard not to admire the odd kind of beauty in it all. There is something deeply peaceful about living in a world where scrolls are moved not by hands, but by tiny, chattering creatures who never learned Latin, but understand time and rosemary like a second language. Tonight, as you lay down on your straw mattress, you will think about that, about scrolls, about silence, and about how, somewhere above the rafters, a squirrel is probably dreaming of ink. It all began with mushrooms, not the kind that grow in shadowed corners of the cellar or sprout in the cloister garden after a wet spring, but the ones Brother Anselm brought in from the woods. Bright, strange things with names no one else in the abbey could pronounce, let alone eat with confidence. He claimed they were medicinal, or possibly musical. His Latin was sometimes ambiguous. Brother Anselm had always been the monastery's oddest resident, not rebellious, just sideways. He took the same vows as everyone else, poverty, chastity, obedience, but managed to interpret them through a lens entirely his own. He kept a garden that bloomed out of season. He talked to bees. He once tried to build a sundial that worked at night, emotionally. No one knew exactly how long he'd been at the abbey. He appeared one morning on a fog-soaked doorstep, clutching a packet of dried nettles and a book of riddles. The abbot accepted him. Monasteries are full of strangers who turn up quietly and stay forever. Anselm took to the apothecary first, then the scriptorium, then gradually everything else. He was the kind of monk who noticed things, the way scrolls curled depending on the humidity, the way Brother Thomas sighed exactly 3 times before sneezing, the way the squirrels watched them from the trees during Vespers. Curious and unbelieving. It wasn't until he caught one stealing a breadcrumb from the altar rail that he had what he later called his moment of squirrel revelation. He told you about it over tea some months later. You'd burned your tongue and he was stirring something alarming into his cup. "They're clever," he said matter-of-factly, watching the steam rise. "Cleverer than some monks. No offense. None." "Taken," you replied, though you weren't entirely sure. They saw things in their own way, nuts, twigs, bird bones. They remember where things are, better than we do. Brother Luke lost that astronomical chart for a week, and one of the squirrels had hidden it in the rafters, perfectly preserved. You hadn't heard this part of the story. Why would a squirrel hide an astronomical chart? Anselm had grinned, the corners of his mouth cracking like old parchment. Artistic taste, or boredom, or maybe they liked the stars. He went on to explain his plan, calmly, as if it were the most natural idea. In the world, train the squirrels to recognize smells. Associate those smells with kinds of scrolls. Reward correct sorting with treats. Create a system, a network, a team. "They're already sorting things in the wild," he'd said. "We're just giving them a monastery-shaped forest to do it in." And for some reason, you believed him. He began immediately, constructing tiny feeding stations behind the apothecary, luring the squirrels with toasted barley and bits of dried apple. He rubbed strips of parchment with mint, basil, lavender. He talked to them softly as they approached, murmuring in Latin and Breton, and once, for reasons unclear, in birdsong. His workshop became a chaos of herbs, scroll fragments, and squirrel-sized harnesses stitched from old robe hems. He worked at night. He hummed under his breath. He seemed lighter, somehow, as if the idea itself gave him wings. Some monks whispered, quietly, of course. There were suggestions of madness, accusations of heresy. One friar claimed Anselm was trying to summon the devil using rodents. But nothing came of it. He never broke any rules, not officially, and the abbot, while cautious, had always had a soft spot for unusual monks with useful hands. Besides, Anselm wasn't only raising squirrels. He continued his duties in the apothecary, brewing tinctures for coughs and salves for burns. He illuminated margins with such delicate vines that even the skeptical Brother Ulrich once admitted they weren't entirely offensive. And, above all, he listened when Brother Peter fell into melancholy after winter set in. Anselm left small packets of dried lemon balm at his desk, with no note. When the cheese soured early one spring, Anselm identified the culprit, a beetle invisible to everyone else. When the bees grew restless in July, he sang to them. He was not mad. He was simply not tame. And perhaps that's why the squirrels trusted him, or perhaps it was the walnuts. You remember one moment particularly. It was late. The scriptorium had emptied. Only you and Anselm remained, seated across from each other in the warm glow of a single candle. Outside, snow fell in a hush so perfect it seemed like part of the liturgy. He held a squirrel in one hand. Tilda, perhaps Sand offered her a strip of mint-scented parchment. She knows, he whispered, watching the small creature sniff and tilt her head. She's learning the difference between theology and botany. Most monks never do. He looked up at you, his eyes shining like ink. This is how the world changes, he said. One small, improbable idea at a time. You said nothing. What could you say that you believed him, that you envied the squirrel, that you wished, for just a moment, you had even half the certainty that he carried in his patchwork robes? Later, after Anselm began formal squirrel sorting sessions, the abbey adjusted, quietly, the way monasteries always do. Scribes began leaving labeled baskets near the squirrel windows. The apothecary door was fitted with a squirrel flap. A monk from another abbey even wrote to inquire about the rodent system, though the scroll was accidentally delivered to the kitchen and used to wrap cheese. Anselm himself never took credit. He insisted it was the squirrels who did all the work. But you know better. You know that without him there would be no system, no tiny harnesses, no mint-scented scrolls, just silence and confusion and the slow loss of knowledge in a world where ink fades and memory slips down now. As the candle guttered and the snow thickened outside, you leaned back in your chair and closed your eyes. Somewhere across the hall, a squirrel leaped from desk to beam, and Brother Anselm, humming softly, bent back over a scroll and began to write. The squirrels do not understand Latin. This much is clear. They do not care about St. Augustine, nor about the difference between a minor and a major feast day, nor the precise spelling of ecclesiastical, but they do care deeply. Walnuts, and in the beginning that was enough. The training, if you could call it that, began with a simple goal: delivery, not precise, not timely, not alphabetized. Just one scroll from one shelf to one monk, without any biting, tearing, or accidental nesting. Easier said than done. Each morning you and Brother Anselm would rise early, before the bells, before the kitchen fire was lit. You'd slip out to the narrow garden path behind the scriptorium, basket in hand, filled with tiny rolled parchments, herb sachets, and a generous helping of shelled nuts. The squirrels would be waiting. Tilda, the boldest, usually arrived first, perched on the windowsill, tail twitching, eyes sharp. Then Benedict, dignified and slow. And finally the twins, who rarely arrived together, but always managed to cause twice the commotion. Each squirrel had a color. Tilda was green, Benedict red, the twins blue and yellow, though no one was ever sure which was which. Anselm tied a small scrap of dyed wool around each one's harness. He claimed it helped with identity formation. You suspected it helped him tell them apart when reprimanding. The first stage of training involved associating the scent of herbs with the location of their treat. A rosemary-scented pouch always contained a walnut sliver, a mint-scented one held dried apple, thyme, toasted barley. The squirrels learned quickly. Their noses twitched, their paws scrabbled. Soon they could identify the correct satchel 9 times out of 10, though they still occasionally opened all of them, just 2. Be sure, next came the scrolls, lightweight, tightly rolled, dipped lightly in the same herbs, and wrapped with a corresponding ribbon. The goal was simple: to carry it from the sorting bench to the marked cubby and return for a reward. The results were mixed. Tilda performed beautifully when she was interested. She would scamper across the beams with the scroll held delicately in her teeth, deposit it neatly, and then turn back to stare at you, unblinking, until the walnut appeared. Benedict preferred dragging the scroll. He never damaged them, but he moved slowly, determinedly, like a monk carrying relics. Once, halfway to the cubby, he paused, curled up next to the scroll, and fell asleep. The twins were chaos. They competed, they wrestled, they stole from one another. One would hide a scroll under a loose tile, and the other would dig it up and run off into the sacristy, trailed by increasingly frazzled novice monks. Still, Anselm remained patient. Chaos, he said one morning, gently untangling. A scroll from a squirrel-sized tug-of-war is just misunderstood order. He began constructing miniature ramps, padded platforms, and shallow sorting trays, scenting each with its matching herb and reinforcing the routine over and over again. The scriptorium began to resemble a very quiet obstacle course. The other monks noticed. They said nothing aloud, of course, but you could feel their eyes tracking the progress. Brother Luke began to leave astronomy scrolls near the training bench. Brother Thomas muttered fewer curses when a scroll was misplaced. Even Brother Ulrich, the staunchest opponent of rodent-assisted filing, was seen watching the twins with something that might have been interest or possibly indigestion. One day, a scroll arrived at its destination, correctly, without prompting. Without error, it was a simple homily, rosemary-scented, ribboned in green. Tilda delivered it to Brother Simon, who copied devotional texts and then, with quiet grace, sat upon the bench and waited. Brother Simon blinked, took the scroll, read the title, then looked up at you. She chose the right cubby, he said softly. You nodded then, reverently. You handed her a walnut half the size of her head. It was a small success, but in a place where nothing ever changed quickly, it felt like a revolution. After that, training intensified. scrolls were placed farther away. The correct cubby was swapped for a decoy. The squirrels adapted. Benedict learned to ignore traps and shortcuts. Tilda began responding to gesture as well as scent. Even the twins, though still prone to elaborate games of squirrel, keep await showed signs of comprehension. Brother Anselm built a logbook. He drew little pictures of each squirrel, noted their behaviors, assigned them aptitudes. Tilda was precise but moody. Benedict was methodical, possibly contemplative. The twins were, in his words, trickster spirits in search of discipline. He wrote down the details of every successful delivery, the herbs used, the distance traveled, and even the weather. He speculated about the effect of humidity on scent dispersal. He pondered whether the color of the ribbon mattered, or if the squirrels simply enjoyed tearing through them, and through it all you kept helping. One scroll at a time, one treat, one quiet encouragement. You were not a scribe, not a scholar, not a trainer, really, but you were part of the story now. The only one who could whistle the way the squirrels liked. The only one who knew that Benedict preferred to start on the left shelf and Tilda hated it. When the scrolls were too tightly rolled, you began dreaming in parchment and rosemary, and even in your waking hours, you found yourself watching the way. The squirrels moved not just their speed, but their attention. They did not rush, they chose their steps. They sniffed the air like readers searching for the right page. It felt holy. You never said that aloud, of course, but you thought it often, and one morning, as snow began to fall outside the scriptorium window, Brother Anselm placed a scroll in your hand. It was blank. Let them choose, he said. You looked at him. But what if they get it wrong? He smiled. Then we try again. You set the scroll down. Tilda approached, sniffed, paused. She picked it up and ran toward the theology shelf. And in that small act of instinct, or luck, or something greater, you understood what Anselm had always known. Every scroll has a story, even if it begins in pause. Instead of pens dot asterisk by the end of that winter, the squirrel system, munificial, exminipicial, and quite possibly divinely absurd, was running at about 64% accuracy. That number came from Brother Anselm's ledger, of course. A notebook of fraying pages and tight, looping handwriting, where he meticulously recorded every scroll attempt, sent, sender, recipient, and result. He used a checkmark for success, a scribbled paw print for attempted, and a small frowning face for inexplicable failure. There were many frowning faces. Scrolls arrived in the wrong hands. Scrolls arrived half-chewed. Scrolls failed to arrive at all and were later found in the latrine. The beehive, or, once memorably, in the shoe of Brother Peter who had been, wondering why he smelled like frankincense every morning. But that was the nature of early progress, and in a monastery where change usually meant a different soup recipe for Lent. The squirrel initiative had already transformed daily life. Brother Thomas began composing small prayers of thanks for successful deliveries. Brother Luke started writing scroll titles in rhyming couplets, allegedly to aid memory, but mostly to amuse the twins. Brother Ulrich, still outwardly scornful, was once caught feeding a squirrel a sugared almond when he thought no one was watching. There was optimism in the air. Optimism and the faint scent of rosemary. But it couldn't last forever. The first true crisis came on a Thursday. Cold, damp, the sort of morning where ink dries reluctantly and monks dry not at all. You were seated at the sorting bench, scrolls prepared, squirrels alert and ready. Brother Anselm had set up a new challenge. longer distances, more complicated shelving, and the addition of duplicate scents placed in the wrong cubbies. It was, perhaps, too ambitious. Tilda was first to misstep. She delivered a scroll on fasting to Brother Felix, who copied musical notation. Felix, either in jest or confusion, proceeded to copy the entire fasting treatise onto a scroll meant for playing. The next morning's hymn included a solemn reminder to avoid salted fish during Advent. The mistake went unnoticed until the midday meal, when half the choir began humming penitential verses between spoonfuls of lentils. Then Benedict got creative. Instead of delivering his scroll, he hid it inside a hollowed-out copy of Lives of the Desert Fathers. It was discovered weeks later when Brother Ulrich opened the volume to find a ball of time-scented parchment and several acorn shells tucked. Inside, the twins, not to be outdone, escalated dramatically. They began competing openly, flamboyantly for delivery speed. One would snatch a scroll from the other mid-run. They bounced across desks, over inkpots, through hanging robes. At one point, they ran across the back of the abbot himself, who was attempting to copy a prayer in peace, when one scroll was accidentally dropped into the font used for blessings, and another was found tied to the tail of the abbey cat. It was decided. A pause was necessary. An emergency meeting was called. Not of the entire monastic community, that would have been unseemly, but a quiet discussion between the abbot, Brother Anselm, and, to your great surprise, you. You were summoned to the library annex, a cold room with draughty windows and a desk that had not been dusted since the Norman conquest. The abbot sat at the far end, fingers laced, his expression neutral. Brother Anselm looked, as he always did, serene, faintly amused, possibly covered in walnut oil. The abbot cleared his throat. There have been, he said slowly, developments. You nodded. Yes, Father. Some scrolls have arrived unreadable. One smelled distinctly of cheese. You nodded again. The squirrel, he continued, was wearing a ribbon that said fast as monk. That one, you had to admit, was your fault. He studied you for a long moment, then looked to Anselm. They are improving, Anselm said gently. But they are not monks. They are squirrels. This seemed to be both his defense and his confession. The abbot sighed. I will allow the program to continue, quietly, discreetly, but no more scrolls in the font, and absolutely no ribbons. You both bowed, relieved. On your way out, Anselm handed you a tiny scroll. It was blank, save for the words, "Patience is the quiet form of genius." You kept it in your robe for weeks. After that, the training became calmer. Scrolls were limited, routes simplified. The twins were temporarily split up, one assigned to the apothecary, the other to the scriptorium. Tilda was given her own workspace, a little cubby above the herb cupboard. Benedict returned to his slow, careful routes, dragging scrolls like holy relics from one bench to the next. And yet, even with the restrictions, there was magic in the air. Monks began composing small verses about the squirrels. Illuminators added tiny squirrels in the margins of psalters. One novice, when asked what inspired him to join the order, said simply, "I heard you had rodents with jobs." Even the errors became endearing. A misfiled list of sins ended up in a scroll on fruit preservation, prompting a brief and heated debate about whether overripe pears were a moral hazard. A note on Lent was delivered with a small acorn tied to it, possibly commentary, possibly accident. One night, you found a scroll half buried in the hay by the window. It was a copy of a devotional, faintly nibbled and wrapped in blue ribbon. Beside it lay a cracked walnut shell. You placed both gently back in their cubby, because the truth was, in all its quirks and misfires, the squirrel system had become something more than a filing method. It was a rhythm, a story, a small miracle, performed daily, not in fire or light or thunder, but in pause and parchment. And so you slept that night, the kind of sleep that comes from quiet purpose. The bells faded into dreams. The wind curled gently around the abbey walls, and above, in the beams of the scriptorium, for squirrels curled into themselves. The day's scrolls delivered, their tiny hearts ticking gently in time with your own. Monasteries, by their very nature, are not built for arguments. They are built for contemplation, repetition, and the soft friction of lives lived slowly. Disagreements, when they arise, do so quietly, with glances, with raised eyebrows, with the unspoken violence of someone placing a scroll just slightly to the left of where it obviously belongs. And so, when it became clear that not all monks were amused by the squirrel system, the complaints did not arrive as words, but as a silence that grew heavier by the day. It began with Brother Ulrich. Of course it did. He was the abbey's oldest scribe and the unofficial guardian of proper monastic decorum. He copied long theological works in a tight, unforgiving script, and had once rebuked a novice for sneezing too enthusiastically during Matin. He had tolerated the squirrel project for some time, mostly by pretending it didn't exist, but one morning a scroll arrived at his desk with a tiny paw print stamped in damp ink across the title page, and that finally was too much. He held the scroll aloft like an incriminating relic, turned slowly in his chair, and locked eyes with Brother Anselm across the scriptorium. No words were spoken. None were necessary. The message was clear. This ends now, brother. Anselm responded by offering him a dried fig. Ulrich declined. Over the next week, the skeptics made themselves known, not loudly, not directly, but in subtle, unmistakable ways. Brother Marcus began, placing all squirrel-delivered scrolls on a separate bench labeled unwinding. Brother Jerome placed nutshells on the floor to test their resolve. Brother Ambrose took to muttering St. Anthony, deliver us, every time a squirrel entered the room. Even Brother Peter, the quietest of the lot, began copying his scrolls onto stiff wax tablets, claiming that squirrels disliked the texture. You felt the shift, the tension, the way conversations slowed when you entered the room, the way monks who had once smiled at Benedict's slow, solemn deliveries now turned away, sighing. The abbot said nothing. He rarely did, but his silence felt less like approval, and more like permission to let things unfold. And then came the incident with the sermon. It was a short sermon, only 2 scrolls long. It had been written by Brother Simon for the upcoming feast of St. Gertrude, patroness of travellers, cats, and Anselm had suggested. Hopefully, possibly squirrels. The scroll was entrusted to Tilda. She delivered it proudly to the lectern. In the chapel on the morning of the feast, unfortunately, it was not the correct scroll. What she delivered instead was a copy of Brother Thomas's medical notes on bowel irregularities in elderly monks. The congregation listened in solemn silence. As the lector began reading about tinctures of anise and the relative merits of early bedtime, the mistake was caught quickly, but not before the entire front row of monks had begun, furiously coughing into their sleeves to mask their laughter. Brother Ulrich was not among them. He stood up, slowly, deliberately, and left the chapel. That afternoon, a scroll appeared on the abbot's desk. No signature, no salutation. Just 2 lines. The rule of Benedict makes no provision for the employment of animals in sacred duty. Let the scribes be scribes, and let the squirrels be squirrels. The abbot said nothing, at first, but the next day a notice was posted outside the scriptorium until further reflection. All squirrel-assisted deliveries are to be suspended, and that was that. The system stopped. The squirrels were still fed, of course, still allowed into the garden, but no scrolls were scented, no ribbons tied. The cubbies went empty. Benedict wandered the rafters aimlessly. Tilda chewed through 3 empty baskets out of what could only be described as boredom. The twins began. Stealing socks. Brother Anselm stopped humming. He still tended his herbs, still copied manuscripts, but something had dimmed. The spark was there, buried beneath years of patience, but it no longer flickered as brightly. You, for your part, returned to your sorting bench each morning, scrolls in hand, with no creatures to receive them. The silence had changed. It was no longer the companionable hush of shared labor. It had become ... sterile, and in the great stone vault of the scriptorium you felt the absence more sharply than you expected, not just of the squirrels, but of what they represented, a kind of foolish hope, a belief that even in a world ruled by bells and rules and carefully inked margins, there might still be space for a little absurdity, a little joy. You missed it, not just the creatures, but the idea that something ridiculous could also be meaningful, that even a system with flaws and chew marks and occasional catastrophic errors might still be beautiful. And then, one morning, something changed. You arrived to find a scroll rosemary netted sit-in. On your bench it was tied in green ribbon. No one had seen Tilda, no one admitted to placing it there, but when you looked up, you saw a flash of fur disappearing into the rafters, and later, as you left the scriptorium, you noticed something new carved into the lintel of the door. A single squirrel, tiny, curled into a ball, and beneath it, in small, shaky letters, "Even silence has room for mischief." You said nothing, you just smiled, because sometimes, in a place built on discipline, the most faithful act is to believe that joy can be part of the rule, even if it has a tail. It began, as many good things do, with a piece of thread and a question no monk had ever asked before. "What if," said Brother Anselm, "one quiet morning we gave them saddlebags?" You blinked. "Saddlebags?" You echoed. "Yes," he replied, holding up a scrap of wool the size of a walnut, with pouches, adjustable, possibly coded. "The current ribbon system is fine, but there's room for growth." He paused, stroking the thread like it might reveal divine guidance. "Also," he added, "Tilda gets cold." And so began the great squirrel gear project, not sanctioned, not budgeted, not entirely logical, but deeply, profoundly earnest. And early designs were crude. Tiny loops of thread, squares of felt, strips of old robe hems sewn into rough tubes. The first prototype was met with indifference by Benedict, horror by one of the twins, and great enthusiasm by Tilda, who mistook it for a new kind of nest and immediately tried to climb inside it. But Brother Anselm was undeterred. He consulted the tailors, or rather, he left small sketches tucked discreetly into their sewing baskets. Most returned unanswered. One was returned with a question mark and what might have been a drawing of a surprised squirrel. But eventually, a novice named Leona, quiet boy with nimble fingers, took up the challenge. Leon didn't ask many questions. He simply nodded when Anselm explained the concept, and then returned 3 days later with a prototype that was, in the abbot's words, alarmingly well made. It had straps, it had buckles, it even had a tiny pocket for dried fruit. The squirrels, once properly introduced to the concept, adjusted more quickly than expected. Tilda wore hers like armor. Benedict accepted his with stoic resignation. The twins fought over theirs until they were issued identical gear to avoid another round of acorn-based dueling. The gear changed everything. With saddlebags came the ability to carry not just scrolls, but notes, messages, even on one memorable occasion a single hazelnut biscuit which did not survive the journey, but was appreciated all the same. And with this increase in carrying capacity came a new problem: sorting. Anselm returned to his ledger. You returned to your sorting bench. Together, you developed what would later be known half-jokingly as the Rodent Codex. The Codex outlined a system of color coding based on subject: green for theology, red for medicinal texts, blue for astronomy and science, yellow for music and liturgy, purple for everything no one quite understood. Each saddlebag bore a small loop of dyed thread to match the contents, and each scroll carried the same color and scent. It wasn't perfect, some shades faded, and once the twins switched loops just to see what would happen, but the structure helped. Suddenly, scrolls were not only being delivered, they were being categorized. Brother Simon called it an act of miniature librarianship. Brother Luke declared it better than anything Jerome ever devised. Brother Ulrich grudgingly agreed to accept scrolls as long as they were color-matched, properly oriented, and unignored. Even the abbot was seen examining a saddlebag with something approaching curiosity. He didn't comment, but he did pat Benedict on the head as he passed, which everyone agreed was a strong endorsement by monastic standards. And the squirrels flourished. They adjusted their routines. Tilda began collecting her scrolls from the western window at sunrise. Benedict preferred the shade of the apothecary shelf. The twins began to specialize, one in deliveries to the scriptorium, the other in messages between the apothecary and the kitchen. You began to know their habits better than some monks. You knew that Benedict avoided sunlight after noon, that Tilda liked to sit beside the fire during Vespers, that the twins had a secret cache of candied orange peel behind the woodpile, and they would trade it for bits of salted oat bread when no one was looking. You even started sewing repairs into their gear, patching loose stitches, replacing frayed loops. It was peaceful work, meaningful, the kind of care that builds not just a system, but a story. One day, while adjusting a new harness on Tilda, you found a small pebble tucked into her side pocket. Smooth, round, pale, not food, not a mistake, a gift, perhaps, or a reminder that even a squirrel, outfitted like a tiny courier, still remembered the world beyond scrolls and ribbons. That night, you placed the pebble on the corner of your writing bench. It sits there still. Meanwhile, the codex expanded. New colors were introduced: orange for seasonal announcements, brown for gardening notes, silver for anything that included a map. Anselm began sketching new designs for winter gear, complete with fur lining and weather-resistant flaps. Leon added embroidery, tiny symbols stitched in colored thread, stars for astronomy, leaves for herbal texts, musical notes for liturgical scrolls. The gear became both functional and beautiful. The squirrels didn't seem to notice the embroidery, but the monks did. Brother Thomas suggested a quarterly parade. Brother Simon began drawing tiny illuminated squirrels in the margins of important texts. Even Brother Ulrichon, a rare, generous dare, remarked that the system was surprisingly consistent for something with tails. It wasn't just working, it was growing. Slowly, quietly, joyfully, the monastery had made room for something holy, unexpected. Not just a method of delivery, but a philosophy of gentle cooperation, of mutual trust, of tiny, clever hands doing holy work. Because what, after all, is a monastery, if not a place where discipline meets wonder? And what is wonder, if not a squirrel in a perfectly tailored blue satchel, delivering a scroll about moon phases to the astronomy shelf, pausing just long enough to accept a raisin from your hand? Asterisk, for all its apparent simplicity, the abbey's scriptorium was not a quiet place, not really. Even in the hush between bells, the room breathed with rustling parchment, the scratch of quills, the soft creak of benches worn smooth by years of patient posture. But now there was a new sound, a soft scrabbling above, a rustle in the beams, a brief, high-pitched cheep of complaint, followed by the unmistakable noise of something small and furry making its opinions known. The squirrels were arguing. No one knew exactly what had caused the tension. Perhaps a disputed scroll, perhaps a stolen nut, perhaps, as Brother Anselm hypothesized, a difference in courier philosophy. Whatever the reason, the harmony that had once defined the squirrel team began to unravel. It began with the twins, always competitive, always mischievous. They had recently begun a silent contest to see who could deliver more scrolls in a day. This might have remained charming had they not started replacing each other's deliveries. More than once, a theology scroll, delivered in a blue saddlebag meant for astronomy, was found tucked under the wrong bench, rerouted at the last moment, by a jealous twin. One even left a scroll halfway between cubbies, daring the other to finish the job. Benedict, ever the stoic, ignored the chaos as long as possible. But when one of his carefully placed deliveries was shoved aside in favor of a twin scroll crumpled and uncolor-coded, he staged what could only be described as a sit-in. He placed his scroll directly in the middle of the floor, sat beside it, and refused to move for the rest of the hour. Tilda, meanwhile, was furious. Not about the scrolls, but the noise. She had cultivated a refined routine: delivery, treat, grooming, nap. The twins' antics disrupted everything. One afternoon, after being startled mid-stretch by a flying scroll, she leapt onto a high beam and refused to come down for the rest of the day. The monks noticed. Brother Simon claimed it was like watching an angelic choir descend into an argument about soup. Brother Luke attempted squirrel mediation by offering treats to both twins at once only, to be scratched, lightly but pointedly, by both. Even you, usually the squirrel's calm anchor, found yourself increasingly frazzled. And then, one morning, you spotted it, high in the rafters, above the sorting bench, wedged between two beams, partially hidden behind a web of spider silkworms, a scroll. A full scroll, carefully tied in red ribbon, scented faintly with thyme. No squirrel had delivered it. No monk had placed it there. With some difficulty and a borrowed ladder, you retrieved it, unrolled it, read it. It was blank, except for one line, written in tiny, scratchy script. If we do not choose peace, the scrolls will remain unread. No signature, no embellishment, just that single line. You showed it to Anselm. He studied it with furrowed brows, then smiled. They're communicating, he whispered, with something between pride and concern. They've moved beyond delivery. Their message changed everything. Anselm called a temporary halt to all deliveries. Not a punishment, he was careful to emphasize that, but a time for reflection. The squirrels were given extra food, their gear was cleaned and restitched, the cubbies were rearranged to reduce overlap. More perches were added above the benches so the twins wouldn't jostle Benedict, and a dedicated shelf was installed for Tilda, complete with cushions and dried lavender. Slowly, harmony returned. Benedict resumed his slow, solemn roots. The twins, after an official treat-time peace, accord brokered by Brother Thomas, began cooperating, again passing scrolls between them like relay runners. Tilda resumed napping on schedule and the scrolls in the rafters. They began to appear regularly. Once a week, tucked in high corners, they arrived without fanfare, always written in the same scratchy script, always brief. Scribe dropped the inkpot. Avoid shelf, for mint too strong. Use chamomile, brother. Peter cried. Scroll was too sad. Add drawings. They were unsigned, unofficial, but always helpful, always true. You began saving them, tucking them into a box beneath your bench. Anselm called them the Whispered Codex. One day, you found a note that simply read, "You are kind. That matters." You didn't tell anyone. You just folded it into your robe and carried it with you the rest of the day. Word spread, quietly, that the squirrels were more than delivery beasts, that they understood, somehow, that their work wasn't just mechanical, it was mindful. Brother Ulrich insisted it was projection by overworked scribes. But even he, when a scroll on obscure saints appeared with a perfectly drawn acorn sketched in the margin, paused before muttering his usual complaints. The project resumed, gentler this time. Scrolls were sent more slowly, fewer deliveries, more care. Treats were no longer rewards, but tokens of thanks. Each squirrel was given a feast day in the monastery calendar, celebrated not with pomp, but with a handful of dried figs and an extra hour of nap time. And through it all, the scrolls flowed, not quickly, not always correctly, but with purpose, because something had shifted, not just in the rafters, but in the monks themselves. Where once there had been rules, now there was rhythm. Where once there was silence, now there was corporation, furry, flawed, and faithful. You often sat beneath the beams in the evening, watching the flicker of squirrel tails as they moved between shadows, watching their tiny saddlebags bob, listening for the quiet scritch of paws against wood. Sometimes, if you sat still long enough, you'd hear a scroll drop gently into the sorting basket beside you, perfectly placed. And sometimes only, sometimes there would be a note beside it, just one line, written in a hand that was definitely not yours. Asterisk, it started, as so many grand ideas do in monasteries, as a joke. Brother Thomas, in one of his gentler moods, had scribbled a marginal note next to the name of Saint Boniface in the liturgical calendar, and also Saint Tilda, patron of scrolls, squirrels, and scented ink. No one was supposed to notice, but of course, everyone did. Brother Luke added a chant beneath its 6 syllables, long and vaguely acorn-shaped in notation. Brother Simon composed a hymn set in an unusually high register to accommodate tiny voices, though he admitted he had no idea what squirrel voices actually sounded like. By the end of the week, someone had pinned a tiny green ribbon to the notice board beneath the daily readings. It bore a single word, written in careful script, Tildis. From that moment, there was no stopping it. Brother Anselm, delighted beyond all reason, declared that if saints could be declared by popular veneration, and popular veneration could include Poe-sized deliveries, then surely a modest celebration, was in order. The abbot, who had grown more tolerant of cheerful nonsense since the scroll-swapping twins had started delivering his tea, on time issued a single sentence in response: "If it causes no fire or schism, proceed." And so preparations began for the first feast of St. Tilda. It was set for the first Sunday of the almond harvest, not because of theological significance, but because Tilda had once been observed hiding almonds in the abbot's slipper on that very date. The morning began with quiet bells, a light breakfast, and a communal reading of On the Beauty of Orderly Filing, a short essay Brother Anselm had written in praise of all the scrolls that had arrived intact. Then came the acorn mass. It was not technically a mass, but it had a liturgy, a procession and a blessing, which was enough for most present. The procession began at the scriptorium, where the 4 squirrels were gently placed into little baskets lined with wool and rose petals and carried by novices through the cloister garden. A scroll was read aloud, a passage from Proverbs about wisdom, chosen because the twins had been seen chewing its corner with particular devotion. Tilda, resplendent in a freshly brushed green harness, sat upright the entire time, blinking solemnly, as petals rained gently around her. Benedict was less enthusiastic. He burrowed under the petals halfway through and did not re-emerge until the final blessing. The twins waved. Yes, waved. There was some debate about whether it was deliberate or merely dramatic tail flourishing, but either way it was met with applause at the garden altar, modest stone bench draped in ivy. Brother Simon performed the blessing. He raised a scroll not scented, but adorned with gold leaf and intoned, "May all who carry wisdom, no matter their pose or posture, be guided in peace." The gathered monks responded with a soft amen, followed by the ceremonial distribution of walnut crumbs. Then came the feast. There were pies, there was honeyed bread, there were roasted turnips shaped like acorns, and a jug of cider that had been hidden in the cellar since Even Brother Ulrich allowed himself a second helping of fig pudding, though he refused to acknowledge the small knitted squirrel someone had placed beside his cup. The squirrels received a feast of their own. A platter was set out near the fire, covered in bits of fruit, toasted oats, slivers of almond, and an entire hard-boiled quail egg, which the twins rolled back and forth in sheer delight for the better part of an hour. Tilda ate only after inspecting every item with care. Benedict, ever restrained, took a single oat and returned to the rafters. As the sun dipped low, casting amber light through the tall chapel windows, the monks gathered one last time. Brother Luke sang the hymn he'd composed, light, airy, slightly ridiculous. The final verse contained the line, "Though she bears no halo, she brings the holy text." There were tears, some from laughter, some from something else, because somewhere between the scrolls and the saddlebags, the chaos and the color coding, the monastery had discovered something it hadn't known it needed. Ritual that made room for joy, devotion that included tail twitches and squeaks, holiness that arrived not on golden wings, but on tiny feet, carrying rosemary-scented parchment. That night, you stayed behind in the scriptorium long after the others had gone to bed. The fire burned low, the scent of wax and wood hung heavy in the air, and from the beam above your desk, a small scroll dropped softly into your lap. It bore no ribbon, no scent, just a line written in the same faint hand as before. She does not need canonization. She is already remembered. You rolled it gently, tied it with green thread, and placed it in a box beside your bench. The whispered codex had a new volume, and somewhere above, in the shadows of the beams, 4 squirrels curled into themselves, warm, fed, and content. The feast of St. Tilda had come and gone, but her story, like all the best stories, was just beginning to ripple outward. It began with a single wax seal, unfamiliar, pale blue, pressed with the image of a badger. The scroll arrived not by squirrel, but by ordinary means, stuck beneath a sack of millet, delivered by a sleepy merchant who claimed, somewhat uncertainly, that it came from the monks across the ridge. It was addressed simply to the monastery with the squirrels. You opened it beneath the sorting bench, fingers dusted with rosemary crumbs. The parchment crackled. The script was elegant, though slightly tilted, as if written from an odd angle or in great haste. Peace and blessings from the brothers of St. Burchard's in the north. Word has reached us by means we do not fully understand that your order has employed certain woodland creatures in the management of scroll traffic. This, if true, is deeply admirable. We are intrigued, and perhaps, if not overbold, hopeful of cooperation. Also, how do you get them to stop eating the glue? It was signed Brother Matthias, humble keeper of scribal creatures, Badger Division. You showed the scroll to Brother Anselm. He read it 3 times, smiled, and said, "We'll need more ribbon." That evening, the twins were dispatched with a diplomatic offering, 2 small scrolls, wrapped in blue and bound with dried mint. Inside, detailed notes on the training process, ink-safe binding methods, and a sketch of the cubby layout used in the scriptorium. A final note, scrawled in Anselm's neat hand, read, "We advise walnuts over glue. The results are tidier." A week passed, then another, and then, early one morning, Benedict appeared with something heavy in his saddlebag.